Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new Record Club episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where each week one of us picks an album for everyone to listen to, and then we review it. And this week, we're going to talk about my recommended record, which is Oasis's Be
Oasis.
Here Now. Oasi.
We're really like pushing the boat out on this recommended album hook as our record club thing. I swear at least
Well,
half of the things we talk about on Record Club, we do not recommend as a general rule.
that's that is very true, and that kind of feeds into the reason that I picked it. There are certain albums, there are certain infamous albums, and then there are albums that a lot of people just fucking hate. And I think it's fair to say that post the cultural reevaluation of this album, as shown beautifully by fellow music content creator on YouTube, Todd in the Shadows, has a great episode on this. Many people have written and spilled ink over Oasis and Be Here Now, but his episode in particular goes into great detail about how the narrative around Be Here Now has substantially changed because Oasis, in their heyday, sort of the titans of 90s Britpop, the sort of, the one of the two big bands that were in the sort of Britpop war. See, the thing is that they came out with two albums at the very start of their career. They came out with What's the Story, Morning Glory, and Definitely Maybe. Two albums that are heralded as rock classics, two albums that people still love. And then immediately after those two incredibly beloved albums, they came out with Be Here Now. And I think that the narrative around Oasis was so set in stone that the potential differences of this album compared to the two that preceded it didn't matter all that much, because superficially, this resembles those albums in many ways. And that sort of led to everyone just saying, oh, this is great. This is just as good as the
Well,
two previous
it
albums.
was a
This is
lot
better.
it was a lot more complicated than that. It had a lot to do with the way that Oasis were talked about in the press and in the media, and a lot to do with the disconnect between music media, which was sort of this hyper frenzied machine in the UK in the 90s, and the general public of music consumers as well. And a lot of the war between Blur and Oasis and all that sort of thing was so played up and so artificially created to a certain extent, although certainly Damon Albarn, Liam Gallagher, Graham Coxon, Noel Gallagher all fed into it to a certain extent. But
Oh,
the thing
yeah.
is, like, oh, we don't need to get into the whole sort of class narrative of Blur versus Oasis because it's been talked about a million
No.
times. The general kind of reductive but not entirely inaccurate view at the time was that Blur represented, the more sort of middle class, sort of Southern English, you know, taste making sort of high culture pop landscape essentially. And Oasis represented the music of the working class, essentially the music of people who essentially had less power and control over what was dictated in higher culture or whatever, and what became conventionally acceptable or cool or any of those sorts of things. And they, through the music they made, but also through their personas and through the way in which the media decided to position them in the UK in the 90s, ended up filling these archetypes very well. But by the time you get to Be Here Now, the war is essentially long dead and gone and forgotten almost. Like Be Here, that the war is as an artifact of the dead mid 90s, when both those bands were at their biggest. But by the time you get to 1997, even Blur were on somewhat of a decline in terms of commercial appeal and acceptance and all that sort of thing. Like, they were very much headed into their own alt rock niche at that point in time. 97, they were doing their self-titled record, which was a definite pivot away from the kind of sunnier, brighter, much more conventionally Britpop sound of the early 90s material, and then they would go further down the rabbit hole from there. And Oasis were still like massively riding the high of Morning Glory, which at the time that it came out, that album was received critically pretty indifferently and even trending towards negativity. A lot of people felt, a lot of critics, a lot of music media in the UK specifically felt that that record was really hackneyed, and they were so enamored with, again, the higher culture of bands like Blur at that time that Oasis felt like a bad joke. But the thing was is that Oasis had this groundswell of success through the audience themselves. They were by far the bigger success in terms of the overall kind of radio play. And even though Blur did win the war in 95 by having their single debut at #1, when Blur and Oasis were releasing a single on the same day, famously. But still, Oasis were the band that I think generated bigger numbers in terms of like successful singles and in terms of being sort of the people's band. And so while Morning Glory was received indifferently, if not negatively, by music press, the fact that people were so enamored with that album, like audiences, genuine, real sort of people who weren't kind of a part of that music media machine, loved that album, loved the songs. It was a transcontinental success as well. It made waves over in the US, which is a very difficult thing for a UK band to do even at that time, because the UK and US music worlds were just so insular and separated. So it got to this point where, music journalists and critics in the lead up to Be Here Now were in this position of being like, well, we're behind the curve on this because people love this music, yet we kind of, snobbishly wrote it off. So we need to kind of correct the narrative. And so Be Here Now, in terms of its initial critical reception, was just adulated like across the board. It got these glowing reviews. And what's really, really interesting about it as well is that even if you don't look at the critical side of things and just look at the commercial side of things and look at the actual run up to this album, this album had kind of a fraught, obviously a fraught recording process, because as anyone who's heard it can probably almost instantly tell, it's the product of a vast budget, much of which presumably was spent on cocaine.
Cocaine.
And that the effects of which are very clear in the music itself, and the excess of it. But also, like, this was a record that Oasis and their label very much wanted to contain any sense of hype on. Like, they didn't want to overhype this, especially because, again, Morning Glory was just a ginormous record, right? So there was this very conscious and concentrated effort from within Oasis's camp to try and play down Be Here Now in the run up to its release. And in fact, I think at one point I read a quote where it was like, the idea was for the record to kind of just be pitched to its audience as, just a set of straightforward, really simple, meat and potatoes Oasis songs, which is a hilarious thing, a way of thinking about this record being pitched once you've actually heard it. But yeah, there was this really concentrated effort to kind of just not create this hype for this record. And a lot of that came from the label being terrified of this album flopping, essentially, because when they heard it, they were just completely, they had the, it was terrified them. It terrified their label. It terrified all the marketing executives because of how long these songs were, how intense they were, how repetitive and dense they were in terms of their soundscapes. So the labels were terrified of what this record would do, and they assumed it would be a massive flop, although they didn't say that at the time, of course. But later on, retrospectively, there was a lot of, there were revelations from people at the time that they were terrified. So there was this attempt to kind of play it down. But the ironic thing is that in attempting to play down this record, they ended up inadvertently generating more hype for it. Because it became this secretive thing. Like, what are Oasis doing? What on earth could they be doing for their follow-up to Morning Glory? Because the label don't want to talk about it. Everyone's being very hush-hush. There was this incredibly...
What's he building in there?
There was this, like, incredible aggression from the label towards, like, radio promoters and anyone who got a copy of the single and played it on the radio. And, there was this, like, there were lawsuits, there were all sorts of things to try and, like, make sure that none of this music leaked. But of course, songs did leak and radios did play leaked songs. And eventually, people were rabid for this album and they received it like that as well. It sold really well. It did well, both commercially and critically, and was a massive success for Oasis. It certainly was not a success commercially, even remotely near the level of Morning Glory. And that's a whole different kettle of fish, but that's the basic sort of kind of context for what this is. And I think now we can kind of get into the main reason why. And Jake, of course, did the thing where it's like, let's talk about the focus on the narrative sort of thing, which I love to do. But of course, really the reason we're doing this record club is because it's a polarizing album in this very group that we're in.
It's a polarizing album, and because this is maybe the longest standing I've had a record club for this podcast, because I put it here basically the moment I went into the Google Doc when we were recording an episode, because Ryley said, and I quote, this album, in reference to the Smashing Pumpkins Sear, this album is better than Be Here Now, but not by much, which made Morgan go irate in the chat later.
Apoplectic.
He was just like, what the fuck were you talking about? To which I was just like, yeah, I don't really, what? I remember going back through Oasis's albums years ago when I went through lots of classic rock records. And Morgan happened to have mentioned to me, he was just like, Be Here Now's pretty good too. Because I only heard people talk about the first two albums. And I was like, okay. And then I listened to it and I was like, all right. And then only after that did I become familiar with the cultural narrative of it. And ironically, an album that I had a completely apathetic reaction to upon first listening, I kept exposing myself to because I kept finding out more about it. I saw the Train Records episodes. I saw Stephen Hyden's episode on Oasis. I read lots about this. And as time has gone on, call it Stockholm Syndrome, I like this album. I think it's pretty good, honestly. Like, front to back. Like, I make no apologies or concessions for my opinion, in that I think front to back, all 60 fucking 8 minutes or however goddamn long 71. It is, and it is too long. 71, it is too long. I know. But all 71 minutes, normally when I have to listen to an album that is anywhere north of 50 minutes for this podcast, I'm like, I put this on last night. I had a good time with the whole thing. And also, I had to do this because rarely do we get the opportunity to role reversal on Ryley, who, you are the biggest devil's advocate I know. I mean, like, look no further than the fact that we just did a record club on MCR's Danger Days, to which you, again, devil's advocate for that record. Rarely do Morgan and I, of all people, get to switch and be the devil's advocate for the very not liked record.
Well, okay. First of all, I think now in the current landscape, it's not a hot take to love this record, and it's not a hot take to hate this record. I feel like at certain points in time, both of those positions have been hot takes, and the way in which the narrative around this album, and whether it's good or bad or tasteful or tasteless or whatever, that's just every possible position you could have on this album has been made a thing. So no one should feel any level of guilt for any position that they have on this record. First of all, let's go back to the quotes. That this thing that I said that's lived in infamy and ultimately led to this. I think at the time when I said that, I was I was certainly, I think, inarguably being provocative. That doesn't mean that I was saying something I didn't believe, but I was certainly being provocative. I don't think that Seer is better than this album. But again, I think they are both examples of colossal excess from bands who, it's interesting because they're both examples of colossal excess and self-indulgence from bands whose best work also bleeds excess and self-indulgence. And so it becomes a much more complicated issue for me in terms of disentangling when I have like wildly different feelings on, you know, different works by those artists that exude those things. And I will say, part of me is sad that this particular opinion that I have now on Be Here Now has gotten the way it has, and then part of me is glad is that, you know, in the last few listens I've had to this, I think I like this less than I ever have. But at the same time,
Good.
I'm not going to do the devil's advocate thing, because I do think this record is bad. But at the same time, it's one of those things where there's a lot about what it is as an artifact, and even about some of the boldest things that it does, that I just do admire as choices that I think are, you know, bold for a band like this to do, even if they're done out of, you know, pure self-regard and ultimately, you know, intense self-indulgence, and not really probably any desire to be like creatively subversive or anything. But, you know, intent doesn't matter. There are bold decisions made on this record for a band like Oasis, coming off the back of the two albums that precede it. And I admire any artist who does makes these kinds of decisions with their whole chest, essentially, and doesn't, you know, sort of go halfway with it. Because there's nothing worse than going halfway with a bold decision, because then you're just like, you're impressing no one. So I find a lot about this record admirable. As a listening experience, it is physically exhausting, it is demanding, it is frequently painful, and it is almost constantly eye-rolling. It is an example of a record that essentially takes every quirk or element of who Oasis are, of who Nolan, Lee, and Gallagher are as performers, exaggerates them to the nth degree under the influence of mountains of cocaine, and puts them in a context of songs and of music that is a ridiculous ballooning of what they have done before. And that's interesting as a proposition. I find, and I don't, so this is an album that I find to be very bad and very, you know, unpleasant to listen to, but I don't find it to be like reprehensible. I don't dislike Nolan, Liam Gallagher for having made it. I think it's certainly one of the most creatively fascinating artifacts in their catalog, but it's just really hard for me to even get started on a good foot with this album. But I don't want to, you know, I've obviously got lots of opinions. So do you too. I've said enough already. I think as well, I imagine a lot of people who come to this video probably are more likely to like this album. So why don't you two, and maybe Morgan as well, so maybe you should go first, actually, since you are, you know, this album's probably biggest proponent, or at least Oasis's biggest proponent here. Why don't you talk about what your first experience was with this album, what your feelings are on it relative to the two, you know, stone cold classics that come before it?
It's interesting. So definitely Maybe, and What's the Story, Morning Glory. I mean, some people are lukewarm to negative on those albums for some reason.
Couldn't be me.
Yeah, I love Definitely Maybe, and Morning Glory is very good. But I love, so yeah, I'm not, for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm not coming at this as a hardcore Oasis hater.
Listening to either of those records and being like, this is bad, is and consequential to me. Now, Be Here Now is on a similar note, I think arguing that Be Here Now in any sense is anywhere near as good as either of those records is also in I just like, all right, dude.
Silly.
We get it.
It's a little cracked, and I have seen a lot of people say this is their best album.
Eh,
Those are certainly words that you can say. We can crack this open, I think, a little bit by talking about the mix of the album, which is assaultive. Painful.
I mean, it's like it's kind of like reverse lightning bolt because lightning bolt are a noise band comprised solely of drums and bass, with the bass being like effects pedaled up the wazoo to just be this unrecognizable husking, deep droning sound. Whereas this is a record where, maybe there's bass on this album. I sure as hell can't fucking hear any, but it's the opposite in the sense that there's fucking guitars up the wazoo. My Big Mouth has no less than 30 tracks of the same guitar line played simultaneously over each other, and it sounds like the future, and it sounds crazy, and it sounds completely terrifying, and it is utterly horrific, and I admire it as much as I hate listening to it.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly a choice that they made. I think it works at points, and at other points it doesn't. I'm not even sure if I would say that it works more than it doesn't, as a staunch defender of this album. But for one, I am equally admiring of this approach as Ryley is, maybe even more so. Because I think something that's important to remember that we haven't mentioned yet, that Oasis was like the live band of the 90s, at least in terms of British music. And they were also very proud of the fact that they were the loudest band in the world.
So what this reminds me the most of, it doesn't necessarily have a lot of sonic similarities, although it certainly comes from the same culture of like successful British bands completely imploding under the influence of a titanic budget and vast quantities of drugs. There's two albums that come to mind, and both of them feel okay, maybe one more so than the other, but there's a British tradition of bands, particularly in the late 80s through into the 90s, who achieved this certain level of success. And it was actually kind of a common theme for a lot of big British bands in the 90s specifically, to achieve this level, this height of success, to be rewarded with hundreds of thousands of dollars to essentially pursue your artistic indulgences as a result of this, and to completely capitulate under the weight of that, and of course of drugs. One example being Stone Roses' Second Coming, and another example being Happy Monday's Yes Please. I mean, these are two infamous albums that are examples of bands, British bands specifically, who had just enormous levels of success and were actually kind of cultural icons that represented everything that British audiences kind of lionize and idolize and strive towards in their heroes, who completely just collapsed under the weight of that. And what's interesting about Be Here Now is that it kind of takes from those sort of cautionary tales of recent history and almost deliberately tries to purposefully be one of those albums, but also be successful at the same time. There's this weird thing about it where it feels simultaneously confrontational in the sense that I listen to this and I cannot fathom that Noel Gallagher is not deliberately trying to alienate significant portions of his audience with the length of these songs and with the mixes of these songs and with how just endlessly repetitive and completely illegible the walls of sound on this record are. I have to believe on some level that he's doing that deliberately provocatively because he is, and he's a student of rock history, right? So he's inspired by these bold, insane creative gambits that successful rock bands do. And so he feels very consciously to me as though he's striving to make one of those massive records, make one of those massive disastrous records, but also at the same time, just completely pull the rug at the same time and actually have it be a success. And there's this very that kind of not conflict necessarily, but that sort of those dual goals with this album to be alienating but also to be triumphant are one of the things that make this so equally fascinating and frustrating while I'm listening to it, because I can see both of these goals together completely running into each other, like there's a brick wall in between them.
Yeah, and knowing either of the Gallagher brothers, this idea that he might be trying to alienate people a little, not that much of a reach. But the thing I was going to say a second ago before I lost my train of thought was that I think there's a deliberate attempt to mimic as close as possible the experience of seeing Oasis live. It's just so loud, and by the time it's over, your head hurts, and you're probably on some substances, and you sort of experience something that it is a sacred handful of hours for music fans, and sort of this album ideally would be able to create that feeling on a CD. The problem with that is that you're listening to it in your car, and you might drive into a fence post or something. So, was this attempt at this idea a success?
Depending on how you look at it,
jury's still out.
Well, and this is the thing, like that whole narrative as well of like a band deliberately going into the studio, like we want to create something that translates our live experience onto record. Admirable goal. I'm not shitting on that as a goal, but it's always kind of struck me as like counterintuitive and kind of almost nonsensical, because these are two very different mediums that create two very different experiences that you can't, and that's kind of the whole point of them. It's like trying to create a radio play that gives you the feeling of watching a good movie. It's like these are totally different mediums that go for totally different things and create totally different experiences using totally different means, that to try and have one emulate the feeling of another is to get away from the point of doing the first thing in the first place. So it's never something that, it's always, I think, a doomed proposition, even if some bands, I'm sure you could probably come up with counterexamples of records that do a great job at this. I'm sure they do exist, but it's always struck me as a strange goal. And my experience listening to this, certainly I've never seen Oasis live, so I don't have that reference point, but my experience listening to this is less like this is simulating the experience of seeing Oasis live, and more like this is simulating the experience of being in the dynamic of Noel and Liam Gallagher and being inside their heads for 70 minutes.
I think the best way to illustrate the points that you were making is really to talk about the track list. And here's the thing, is that Be Here Now flawlessly gives you a microcosm of the whole album, I think, with more or less with the first 4 songs, as each of these embody a different kind of track that appears on this record. And a lot of them feel at odds with each other, and that's kind of why, for as much as I like, for people who love this record, and as much as we think the opinion that if you think this is like your favorite Oasis album and if you think it's their best, even though we think that's cracked, like I want to see the vision. I get it. But the fundamental flaw I have with this album, really, to me anyway, is that when this band are going for those big, indulgent, you know, compressed, loud as fuck moments, those still have their limit. And this album is just kind of at its best when Oasis are just kind of doing their old Oasis-y things.
I
Like,
agree.
for example, I think that this is sort of a balance of the two, and in its maybe most effective form, the intro track. Do you know what I mean? Which, first of all, the titles and lyrics on this album, every single song Oasis have ever made, especially the great ones, they don't mean anything. Like, I'm not trying to take away from the meaning of songs or trying to take away from like the evocation that certain lyrics have, which you can certainly feel. Like, you know, when I listen to What's the Story, Morning Glory, the lyrics on that album matter, but do they specifically mean something? I would argue probably not.
They mean very like simplistic things. The idea is that they exist to be rock songs, right? And the lyrics are purely functional to the extent that they create that feeling that classic rock to the Gallagher brothers creates in them. It's all about love. It's all about, you know, these very sort of hippy dippy psychedelic ideas of freedom and all that sort of stuff. And it's all very, you know, in that way, I think actually, and I agree with what you're saying, but I also say that I think that on Definitely Maybe, the lyrics have a bit more substance. And I find actually that record to be quite, I don't want to say something trite like moving, but there's a genuine, like, I think there's some significance to what those songs are about and the idea of what Oasis are reaching for there that they only need to do once on their debut record, because once you achieve that level of success, then all that matters is sustaining that feeling of that endless high, basically.
I would say that the lyrics on an album like that are aspirational. It sees Oasis writing about themselves from like a goal standpoint. They want to be rock stars, and that's what that album is about. It is about wanting to be big, wanting to be a rock star. And then you have this album, which instead of about being these aspirational qualities, is about music. Like, if you look on the album here and you actually pay attention to the lyrics, there are some more like, you know, songs that are about like, you know, relationships, and, you know, there's like odes of like rock balladry and stuff, but a lot of the content on here is actually about the idea of music itself. And it's vague. It's not exactly a grounded lyrical theme, but when you have these song titles and stuff like, excuse me, hold on, let me say this correctly. Do you know what I mean?
Do you know what I mean? It's like, that is the perfect title. That's the perfect title for the opening track and lead single of this album. It is completely vacant. The idea is the listener creates meaning because there's none to be created. It's a feeling that cannot be translated. And that's why the record sounds the way it does as well. It's this idea of feelings of, you know, euphoria and excitement and passion that are so intense that they cannot be, you know, translated. And all you can do is just make the most fucking huge noise as possible. And that's the whole thing.
And look, that's honestly, that's an admirable goal. I think that there are lots of bands that I love that I think Oasis are maybe not intentionally drawing from, but there are moments on here that sound suspiciously like other kinds of music that I'll get to in a moment that do feel like they're shooting for something a little bit loftier than what they normally go for. But do you know what I mean? This is literally a phrase, like a little British-ism, that if you watch any interview or listen to any content with Liam and Noel Gallagher, if you listen to them, this is something they say at the end of every sentence. This is a filler phrase that they use. And basically, like, so like, I mean, so many songs on here, the fucking final track, not really the final track, but the final proper track, it's getting better, man. Like, these are all things that you can only quintessentially imagine the Gallagher brothers saying. And when you have this big ass opening song, which like the lyrics at the beginning tend to allude to going back home, and then it just becomes this big, do you know what I mean?
Well,
And then
that's
it
the
just
thing.
gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Eventually you got these enormous fucking string swells, and I'm not going to argue the fact that I think this song is like, structurally it shoots its load like immediately. Like as soon as you get to that first chorus, that is as big as that song is. Like it's not even necessarily that all of the instrumental ideas are exhausted there. It's just that is as loud as a song can feasibly be while still remaining mostly legible in its ideas. And it can only become so much bigger. I think the song sustains itself well on that energy, though I can imagine it would be off-putting to other people. But as somebody, again, a lot of my defense of this record and defenses of its production will probably have to do with the fact that, the last 2 years, I've been listening to a shitload of stuff like Lightning Bolt albums, of shit like shoegaze, and it's been annihilating my brain. So when we get to certain songs on this album, I can't help but view it in the lens of someone who enjoys stuff like that.
I think a lot of the modern reappraisal of this record, particularly from people who think it's the best Oasis record because they're coming at it from a perspective of looking for music that's transgressive and not really being Oasis fans, I think that's pretty commonly expressed sentiment, and fair enough. I like what you said about for the record. I think that, do you know what I mean, is definitely the track that I think is best representative of what this album is and kind of a microcosm of it, and literally basically exactly 1/10 of the album's runtime. And also my favorite thing here, because like, again, the thing I like the most about Be Here Now is the idea of what it is trying to be. And I think that
I agree.
It gets that across fairly well in this song, to the point where the rest of the album, either the other songs that do what this song does have no reason to exist because this song's already done it, and the other songs that are completely different and more reminiscent of older Oasis, awesome, but why are they here? Like, and so it's this weird position that the album is sitting in. Although, and I'll expound on that in a second, but like, yeah, so do you know what I mean? It's everything the album is going to do. Essentially, it's laid out for you. I like what you said about how it shoots its load early, because to me, like, all of these songs are basically an attempt to create, all of these songs shoot their load early, and what they try to do essentially is to sustain the feeling of the orgasm constantly. And as great as an orgasm is, I'm sure we can all agree, I imagine it wouldn't be nearly as great if it lasted for an hour and 10 minutes. At a certain point,
speak for yourself, bro.
At a certain point, maybe 50 minutes in, maybe, or whatever, you would start to say, I'm ready for this to stop. and that's kind of a indicative, it's a crude example, but it's kind of indicative of the experience of this record, for me. Certainly, not every song is like that. As you've kind of already hinted at, you've got some stuff. And then this is another thing that's weird about Be Here Now, is that the first like 3 songs in particular are so extreme in their mixing decisions and mastering decisions and general production style that when you get to some of the songs that in the middle of the record that sound much more balanced, not great from a production standpoint, but still much more balanced than some of the earlier songs, it's just a little bit disorienting. Like, it's like, yeah, the album needs this kind of dynamism, but also at the same time, it feels like it loses a little bit of its identity. And the only extent to which it retains identity in these different moments is the sense that all of them are too long. Every song, every song on this record is at least 2 minutes longer than it needs to be, even the best ones. And that's the only thing about the songs in the midsection of this record. And specifically, I'm talking about songs like Stand By Me, Girl in the Dirty Shirt, Fading Out, for instance. Solid songs, solid, decent songs, some of the best on this record, and all of them feel to some extent as though they either don't fully belong in what this record is trying to be, or they're molded into what this record is trying to be by being just ridiculously expanded to the point of sheer redundancy. And that's a big stumbling block in the listening experience of this record. And also, I just catch myself being like, yeah, you know, songs like I Hope I Think I Know, Girl on the Dirty Shirt, Fading Out. Yeah, these are all solid songs, but also like they're solid for this album. Like they're if I were to transplant these songs and put them on, you know, Morning Glory or Definitely Maybe, they would easily be the weakest songs on those records. So I still feel as though coming at this, trying to be kind, I still have to be really squinting with even the brightest moments on this record. I would enjoy this a lot more as a proposition and as a listening experience if, you know, I would enjoy it less, but I think I would even appreciate it more if if this record were just 80 minutes of songs like the first 3 tracks and songs like the last 3 tracks, some of which are legitimately beyond the pale terrible, but I would but I still like I still think that's where the record is its own thing most. And you know, you get to a certain point in the second third, I guess, of this record where look, I know people love, you know, Don't Go Away as one of their most enduring singles. I think it's Liam at his most insufferable from a singing perspective. I don't care for this song. Be Here Now, the title track, I think is just just juvenile and really stupid, musically speaking, and just completely redundant at this point in the record. I'm completely mentally checked out at this point, but I get it. I get why people love these songs. I get why they endure. It's just I am spent by this point, and I'm already mentally anticipating the experience of having to endure all around the world, and it's getting better, man. And I'm physically, you know, I'm clenched in anticipation for this section of the record, such that it makes. See, here's the thing: like I've always, with those first 2 Oasis records, I like Liam Gallagher as a singer. I think that his nasally whine makes for some of Oasis's most powerful emotional moments on a lot of songs on those first 2 records. But it's like, with something like this as well, it's very easy to have too much of a good thing. And it's very easy for something that has an appeal, but that rests on this delicate line between kind of sucking and being good. There's a certain point where that is just going to tilt into unbearableness. And it does it so much on a lot of the vocal deliveries on this album. You get like Liam's vocal tendencies exaggerated to just parodic degrees on certain parts of this record. Like I can't remember exactly.
Don't go away.
I can't remember exactly what the line is, but on All Around the World, he at some point he says, "I know I'm gonna shine," and he turns the word "shine" into like 3 or 4 syllables at least.
Yeah,
And it just makes me kind of retch a little bit. It's just, I get it, but it makes it harder now to go back and listen to songs that I like him on, because I've just had this souring experience.
No, like that's the thing I was about to say, is that I hate how, even though we come down on different sides with this album, I kind of largely agree with everything you just said. It's just that the album, for the most part, I think works in spite of itself, because like for 80% of it, it just kind of leans on the general muscular strengths that Oasis have always had. And granted, those are tainted occasionally, and this is what holds me back from saying that this is this, you know, sincere commitment to this idea of the overblown, coked out record, is that there are moments and production choices like the vocal mixing, which, here's the thing. I think the reason this doesn't work on here is purely because of the way this album is produced, that his voice is such a higher frequency than everything else that it just cuts through these fucking just gelatinous, pillowy fucking walls of fucking shoegazy noise, and then it's just like this little so even if you like him, it doesn't sound great. And he really does feel like there are tons of moments throughout this entire album, like for instance the ending of Do You Know What I Mean, where it feels like it goes on for an extra 20 seconds just to antagonize the listener, because the ending of this song is a complete fucking non sequitur. It's just this weird instrumental whatever the fuck, and that happens a couple times on this album. Which, another key difference is that you think every song on here is 2 minutes too long. I think every song on
At
here is
least, I
1 minute
said at
too
least.
long.
Okay.
At least two. And I think every song on here is 1 minute too long, which I think goes to show you way more about what we value as listeners, because I feel like they would strike a bit more of a sweet spot on that. But we've been dancing around this the whole time. We have to talk about My Big Mouth, because this song,
Yes.
like when I listened to it, I could like I back when I listened to these albums before, I was not nearly as attuned to the idea of music production. Like, I just heard Be Here Now and I heard a rock album. When I listened to this now, when I listened to this when I underwent a bit of a like, I listened to every album from Todd and the Shadows Train Record series in an attempt to rank them all. And when listening to this song, I was like baffled that it existed, because even by the standards of this record, I think this sticks out like a sore thumb. Not even just because of like the fact that he shamelessly rattles off two Beatles references fucking immediately, which are all over this fucking album. Jesus fucking Christ, they're everywhere. This song is obnoxiously loud. And the thing that I fucking hate, man, is that it kind of goes. I
Oh,
look,
it
there
beats the rubber off your tires, dude.
the second half of this, those really, really like high pitched up guitar noises, this is a My Bloody Valentine song. This sounds straight off of Loveless in its second half. I enjoy it in the exact same way I enjoy something like that. It's not as good. It's not. I want that to set the record straight, just because when you make something loud and compressed, you're not automatically like, the amount of effects pedals that My Bloody Valentine use allow them to achieve a kind of equilibrium of loudness, but I still have to admire this.
The thing is, like, My Bloody Valentine used like effects pedals to create a kind of sense of actual depth in their huge guitar
Yes,
sound.
you're
Whereas
correct.
Noel Gallagher's like, what if I just take the same guitar line and I just take 30 tracks of it and I just put them on top of each other? So it's like 30 guitars are playing at the same time. Boom. And it's like, it's caveman brain. So I admire it in a certain sense. I gotta tell you, like, more than any other thing about this record, I want to like My Big Mouth, because it's so much of what this song does is the kind of thing I feel like I should be really into. It's like proto hyper pop in a certain sense. The way you listen to hyper pop, the way that guitars are produced, like, it's one of my favorite bands of the last 15 years is Sleigh Bells, and they do basically all their songs, especially in their earlier era, the guitars sound exactly like this. And
I was gonna say Jessica Rabbit has several cuts on it where
yeah,
it sounds exactly like this.
yeah. I mean, so I love a lot of music that has very clearly taken influence from this point, but there's just something about, again, I think I a lot of it comes down to the personality as well. Like, I a lot of the musical decisions here are set up for them to be things that I would particularly enjoy. It's just that hearing them executed in the context of 1997, incredibly coked out, massively self-indulgent, completely wallowing in wealth and excess and disregard for anything except for the perpetuation of that, Noel and Liam Gallagher, just putting it in that context just kind of sours it for me. It's just like, I don't want to hear My Big Mouth. You shut up. And
I mean, that's what the song is about. It's literally them singing about how fucking annoying they are.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, okay, And like I made fun of Liam Gallagher's vocal deliveries on this record being a little bit exaggerated. And for the record, my favorite Oasis song is a song which essentially I think the success of which they used as the basis for justifying this entire record. That song, of course, being Champagne Supernova. This album is 70 minutes of trying to create another Champagne Supernova very aggressively. And it speaks to, I think, the power of that song, that it's incredibly hard for them to do. That song is, I think, quintessential crystallized, along with like Live Forever. That song is quintessential crystallized everything that Oasis are, everything Oasis represent, the aspiration, the starry-eyed just excess and the leading into the melodrama of the rock star dream. Everything about that is perfect, and they capture that so beautifully. And then once they've got all of that, and once they've done all of that, there's just nowhere left to go. And so there's something about the attempt to replicate that feeling that a song like Champagne Supernova gives you, but doing it without any of the necessary passion or drive, or that just makes it feel so cynical and so just blunt and unfunny, and kind of just it just really rubs me the wrong way. Like it's just it kind of feels like, in attempting to replicate the feeling of songs like Champagne Supernova and Live Forever and all that sort of stuff, all those massive guitar epics, but doing it with no actual drive or no actual tangible passion or aspiration or any of the stuff that makes those songs feel colossal and larger than life. It just feels like a slap in the face, to be honest. And that's probably like quintessentially, if I really cut deep down to the heart of why I don't like this record, it's that it feels like constantly it is sort of slapping you in the face and not really. And again, on an abstract, separated from the experience of listening to this level, I can appreciate that, especially from a band as like sycophantic and hungry for acceptance and fame and success as Oasis. I can appreciate the sheer belligerence of what this record is. And it's certainly, from a narrative perspective, the idea of making an album that completely essentially chews up and spits back out at you the feelings and the pure wonder that those first two albums created. That narratively is certainly like a pretty cool twist in the story, but it's just not what I come to Oasis for. It's not. I don't give a shit how you feel about your fame now, or how much cocaine you're doing, or how it's just juvenile.
And here's my perspective on that, is that everything you've said is true, and also I can't hear him, so I don't care. My Big Mouth, to me, perfectly encapsulates knowing every word of the song the band you're seeing live is playing and singing along with it, while the person next to you doesn't know the song and has absolutely no idea what the singer is saying, or even can really make out what they're getting at. To me, My Big Mouth is the runaway success of this album, because it feels like the moment where they actually really got to the meat and potatoes of what they were going for here, which is to replicate the feeling of what it's like to hear the title track off of Morning Glory, or Acquiesce off of the Master Plan live, to just absolutely gargantuan monolithic rock songs. And this is getting at what it's like to hear that in your chest, and sometimes hearing it in your chest hurts. You ever have a concert hangover? This is like being to the concert and experiencing the hangover at the same time, which is suboptimal, perhaps. Like, I love this song, but I only give it a 4.5 on Rate Your Music.
Hey, look,
because
I appreciate restraint when I
giving
see
it giving it a 5.0 seems like crossing a line to me. It's like, well, I can't wholeheartedly endorse something so outwardly abusive to my eardrums. Like I was listening to this song earlier today, and I wanted to take I think you call it an otoscope, where it's the thing that the doctor has that they look in your ear. It has the light on it.
Yeah.
I wanted one of those to peer inside my own ear and see if it was as red and swollen as it felt. And it probably was.
Well, look, yeah. I don't have anything to say there. That's absolutely valid.
I appreciate the validity of Morgan's statement here is like the concert hangover thing. I really like that comparison because it perfectly demonstrates why you would want to expose yourself to music like this, is because it's so visceral that, yeah, it kind of hurts and it's kind of overblown. It's not exactly optimal, but there is something of value there. There is something of like, I've been to venues where I could barely hear shit and I still had the time of my life. And this does get at that experience to some degree. However, I think that the song after this, maybe the biggest problem this album has for me personally.
Don't Noel. Look, for all of what I said about Liam Gallagher's,
that's the only thing that Liam Gallagher has been able to say over the past 30 years. Just, no.
For all of the shit I gave Liam Gallagher for just really leaning into these, most excessive qualities of his voice, I still will take his singing voice any day over Noel's. And it's not that Noel's a bad singer. He's not. He's just a boring one. He just doesn't have any.
That's the problem with Magic Pie for me. And like the biggest problem that I was hinting at earlier is that I can defend everything on here to some extent. What I cannot defend is the fucking sequencing on this album for many reasons, but primarily here because you get the most boring stock song. Like, look, Magic Pie, this is not a song I would classify as unenjoyable, but it feels hideously limp compared to the last two tracks.
And 7 minutes long.
I would classify it as unenjoyable. I'll just go ahead and make that call.
Lyrically, this song is too vapid even for this album by my fucking estimation, and at its length I make no excuses for it. Its legibility compared to My Big Mouth really, and its lack of instrumental progression really just kind of make it pale in comparison to the at least admirable excess of the first two tracks.
To me, the difference can be perfectly demonstrated by the vocal cadence of the most memorable parts of each of these first three songs and what makes the difference between them. Do you know what I mean? It's like, all my people right here, right now. Do you know what I mean?
That's the kind of sound that this band was built to make. Just that exact sound.
My Big Mouth is like, in my big mouth. And Magic Pie is like,
I disagree with only one part of that, which is that My Big Mouth does not sound like My Big Mouth. It sounds like My Big Mouth.
Yes,
I agree completely. The harshest condemnation I can possibly give this album, and it's not even my words, is that this album is Liam Gallagher's favorite Oasis album. And
that's fantastic.
Magic Pie is Liam Gallagher's favorite song on this album. So
that's like the wrongest answer you could possibly have.
It just tells you everything about. Look, and I think that Liam Gallagher is honestly one of the most endearing figures to emerge from this whole era. Someone who is just so just he's like a puppy that never grows up. And that's what he's been like for the last sort of 30 years, essentially. And he's perpetually existed in this state. No talent.
Not a therapist alive who would be able to unpack his relationship with his brother in a meaningful
No, but
way.
he's like, I think part of it is just that he brings approximately zero talent to this band. The band is null, essentially, and he's just the mouthpiece. And there's something about someone like him who's just, you know, he just has nothing in his skill set whatsoever except being his talent is to be a rock star, and all the stuff about being a rock star that has nothing to do with music. His talent is doing all the rock star shit, right? His talent is snorting mountains of cocaine and jumping off of a balcony or into a swimming pool sort of thing, right? Like that's the sort of thing that Liam Gallagher was made to do. And Noel Gallagher is kind of just sort of behind the curtain doing all this stuff. And I know there'll probably be Oasis fans out there who are like, you're reducing Liam too much in saying that. I don't think I am. And I don't say it in a mean way. Like, I'm not saying it in like, oh, Liam Gallagher is just, he's a fucking Paris. No, he's not. He's great. The band needs Noel and the band needs Liam. Without them, there's nothing. You have to have what Oasis is the simultaneous kind of symbiosis and relentless antagonistic clash of these two figures. That's everything that Oasis are. They have these two men who have simultaneously have the same goal, but completely different philosophies behind that goal. They both want to be rock gods, but no one wants to be rock god because he thinks that that's the highest form of art and of human ambition, essentially, to reach that peak. Whereas Liam wants to be a rock god because he thinks that the kind of hedonistic lifestyle that affords you is the height of the human experience. And you are morally obligated, if you're in that pursuit, to be as hedonistic as possible. And so these completely different clashing personalities who somehow, the result of that singular goal from those entirely different perspectives is this music, right? That is so just completely... it's ridiculously simple, and its simplicity is part of its power. But yeah, so I think at the end of the day, like, there's still plenty here that people who love Oasis and people, I'm sure the reason why I think actually this album probably gets more shit and probably has always gotten more shit from people who aren't Oasis fans in the first place. I don't have any evidence here, but I imagine that like at least a good 80% of Oasis fans from all eras, including those who kind of experienced them in real time, probably have always really liked, if not loved, this album. And so much of the controversy around it feels a little bit manufactured to me, or feels a little bit like, not that the album, obviously from what I've said, not that the album doesn't beg, takes and doesn't kind of, provoke and do things that would mean that you'd be justified in calling it a colossal failure. But I still think that it doesn't necessarily betray a lot of what Oasis have always been about. It just leans into this particularly self-aggrandizing aspect of them, where it's like the best Oasis stuff works because it's like it's entirely self-indulgent about these guys in the pursuit of this, eternal kingdom rock god ideal, right? And the entire time they bring you along with them in that journey, and their aspiration to that mountaintop is your aspiration as well. That's the core fundamental reason why those first two albums work, is that feeling is something you can tell they believe, and they make you believe it too, and they make you believe it for yourself, and they pull you into that journey. Whereas when you get to the mountaintop, then all of a sudden your audience are not, it's harder to bring your audience into the story and into the world, into the aspiration, once the aspiration's been achieved, because now there's a fundamental disconnect between what your music is about and what your audience knows. So that's kind of where I struggle with it as well. It's the core appeal of Oasis, that sense with which, it's this journey to the mountaintop. Once you get there, it's not the same as the journey, as the aspiration. So that's kind of, I guess, if I had to boil it down to why this doesn't work for me, but also why I imagine it works for a lot of people, because, I imagine for a lot of people, what Oasis are doing here, this very blunt and kind of crude translation of the feeling of the height of their success, this prolonged high, this completely numb sense of, you know, vacant euphoria, is something that is just, you know, awesome in the you know, classical sense of the word, to get lost in. But I just don't, it just isn't for me.
You know, I think you could call this album many things. I don't think Dishonest is one of them. I think it's pretty much a perfect translation of what everyone in this band was feeling at this time, perfectly translated into music. And the thing about that is, this is that they were at the part of their career where in the music biopic things are going, but you know, they're starting to come apart while everything is in motion. Literally, the structure is collapsing. There's too much on it, and it is moving too fast to sustain anything. So in that sense, this album is a success in the sense of wanting to listen to it for its entire 70-minute runtime. I'm good. I guess just to summarize, I am, as I think I've communicated, fairly positive on this album. Even listening to some of the songs I love on this album in full is a bit of a trial. Both Do You Know What I Mean and All Around the World are probably 5 minutes too long, frankly. Both songs I like, but you get to a certain point in their runtimes and you're like, we're still here. Where is the next train?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be fair, I think that All Around the World it wouldn't be what it was if it weren't what it is, which is a mouthful, but you get what I'm saying. Like, my favorite quote is in association, and I've read a lot of what the Gallagher brothers have had to say about this record over the years, but my absolute favorite quote about this, anything to do with this record, is from Noel talking about this song in particular, because it was one of the first songs he ever wrote, you know, before they were even a band, and it was the idea
he was saving it.
Yeah, he was saving it to the point where they could afford to record it, you know, with the way he envisioned it, with a 36-piece orchestra. And my favorite quote is he says that, imagine how much better Hey Jude would have been with 3 key changes towards the end. And that quote, I think, embodies everything you need to know about the particular perspective of this record, because no rock stars in modern history are bigger acolytes of the Beatles than Oasis. You know, many thousands of rock stars are, of course, acolytes of the Beatles, but still none more so than Oasis. And so to have in the middle of this coke-addled frenzy, to have Noel Gallagher saying, what I wanted to do essentially is improve Hey Jude, and I did it by adding 3 key changes and making the song 9 minutes long. That's all you need to know, right? And I agree, Morgan. The reason what this record would be even more of a failure, and I imagine would work for less people if there was ever the sense that the Gallagher brothers weren't committed to and didn't believe in what they were doing. And that's absolutely true of this. They believe in this 100%. It's just that in moments like this, when Noel says, what I wanted to do is improve Hey Jude, it's maybe that they believed in themselves too much.
And I think that there are parts of this album where they acknowledge it. My favorite song on here is I Hope, I Think, I Know. And look, the upper echelon of songs on this album for me do consist of Oasis doing Oasis-y things, as in the songs that most easily slot into those last 2 albums are probably the best ones here, which again is its own problem. But the thing is that they go and I like them. And so I really can't mark the album down that much for it. But first of all, this song in particular has, in my opinion, the best hook on the whole album. The "You'll Never Forget My Name" hook, which is great, super catchy. It is also a monument to this album's staggering hubris, and it would be so easy to dislike it because of that. However, it's attached to one of the most solidly built rock songs that this band have made. Look, it's got a shorter runtime. It feels like all of the strengths, sans the, enormity of this album are here in spades. And I think that a lot of other songs on here too are to some lesser degree kind of that way as well. I think there are, of course, there's Beatles fucking references all over this album, but there is one particular like moment of reference on The Girl in the Dirty Shirt, which I think is an okay song. It's pretty enjoyable, but I think this particular is a direct attempt to emulate the Beatles. Like, the guitar work here is so reminiscent of George Harrison, and the synced like drum and bass part, which, this is one of the songs where the bass is actually like fucking audible. It sounds exactly like something you would find on Revolver. It's nice. I like it well enough. Fade in out is kind of the same thing for me. I just think it's solid. The mileage they get out of the various guitar tones on here is pretty honestly impressive. There's for as dynamic as a song.
I think that song
it is as dynamic as a song on here is capable of being, which is not a lot, but still I think is sufficient. The beloved song on here, Don't Go Away, is like, this is again, this is a point where I find myself agreeing with Ryley a little bit, in that this is one of the most earnest songs on the album, and it feels really melodically tangible to harness something a bit more melancholy, and it doesn't super overstay its welcome. But the thing is that, my God, is it hindered by the really fucking standard rhyme scheme. The lyricism on here is so, don't go away, say what you say.
That's not a new thing for Oasis, but usually, at least you're not made to focus on that, because there's just more dynamic stuff happening. The song.
Look, this is also true for All Around the World, which I think a lot of people see as the kind of emblem of this album, and that a lot you either hate it or you love it. And it might be a reach, but I really do kind of see this song as being like as close to an important song for Oasis, not an important song.
Generational anthem.
You just stress that qualifier. It's big, it's overblown, it's lyrically skin deep, and it leans so heavily into Beatles worship that it feels distracting. But the thing is that the chorus feels like a distillation of this band at its biggest and dumbest. And all it is Nolan Liam talking about big sounding music that makes people feel better, spreading the word to as many people as possible. And that's just what you do when you're the biggest rock band on earth, right? And that's what Oasis was. I just have to admire the balls. It's enormous. It progresses satisfyingly, and it feels like it's a populist in the best way that rock music can be, that's like this.
It's just one of the funniest aspects of this entire album to me is the fact that the song has a reprise at the end of the record. Like, it's a 9-minute song, and then it's gonna reprise one song later.
A little more.
I have notes for every song on this album. The only note I have for the reprise at the end is lol, LMAO.
If you listen to the version of this with, I think it's the Japanese bonus track as well, then you also get All Around the World demo right after the reprise. So it's like you get 3 All Around the Worlds in the space of 4 songs. It's just really funny.
There's only one world, guys.
Well, and just to mention the track list at the end here, I brought up the sequencing earlier. One of the most baffling choices on here is to stick It's Getting Better Man as the penultimate, technically, / closer to this album, which, like, what? Why? Ended on All Around the World.
Just putting this out there, absolutely my least favorite song on this album. I cannot. It might just be a product of fatigue at this point, but
that does not help.
Not underestimated, but like, handily one of the worst sounding songs on the album. It just sounds awful, completely just crushed to bits mix wise, just nothing going on there. It is one refrain for 7 minutes with this. I mean, at least All Around the World has an audible soundscape, of actual music that sounds like it has some level of dynamism. And then it's like, you have that for 9 minutes, and let's do another 7-minute song that does the same gambit, except let's make it sound like it's fucking bit crushed for some reason, just completely compressed to the point of, just that's everything I hate.
As someone who wants this album to double down on its excessiveness, this album would absolutely be better if that song was not on it.
Yeah, I mean, how do you do a song like All Around the World and not end? I mean, I guess maybe that's one of the defining factors of Be Here Now, is that you do a song like All Around the World and you don't end the album with that. It keeps going.
You know what would be funny? Know what I mean?
It's like, how much more black could it be?
None more black.
Just none
more black. It can't be.
So just to kind of put a capstone on this as well, I think one of the aspects, if we're looking at it from a cultural standpoint in rock music in 1997, this album came out August 1997. This album came out, I think, 3 months after Radiohead released OK Computer, an album which completely changed the landscape of rock music, certainly in the UK, but even across the world as well. And you have to imagine as well, listening to this album in a landscape where OK Computer came out 3 months ago. And so you're already having this shift. I'm not saying, this album's bad because it's not like thinking about properly, worldly issues like OK Computer is.
It doesn't have a spoken word bit about antibiotics.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that what Radiohead did with OK Computer was
I wish it did, though.
What Radiohead did with OK Computer was just completely, make this epic, sweeping, dense, multifaceted masterpiece of rock music that infused so many different directions that the genre was heading, with so many different new directions that they completely created and infused into this record. And so, we're in this album is coming out literally in a post OK Computer landscape where, by comparison, it's of course going to seem not only more trivial, which obviously, but also just more irrelevant and more just kind of baffling as a proposition, because,
it's like listening to a hard bop jazz album that's like fine, and then listening to Bitches Brew. It's like,
it's like listening to, I'm going to take that example and I'm going to kind of double down on it. It's like listening to a 30s swing jazz, 12-inch, and then putting on like the Inner Mounting Flame. You know what I mean? It's or it's the reverse of that. It's like listening to the Inner Mounting Flame, and then 3 months later someone puts out, Busby Berkeley or whatever. I don't fucking know. Yeah. Well, anyway, like Be Here Now, this conversation has dragged on past the point of natural endpoint several times. So I think let's wrap this up and maybe do our favorite
Before
tracks.
we do that, though.
Okay.
I just very quickly want to point out that Liam Gallagher. Yes. That Liam Gallagher released a solo album last year.
That's true.
It's called Come On, This man has never been sober.
Like he's this is the thing. Liam Gallagher is a prime example of someone who did so much coke in the 90s that he is permanently brain damaged. And and everything he says and does is a product of that state that his brain has existed in.
The Ozzy Osbourne of the 90s.
I mean, his second album is called Why Me? Why Not? Which is just like...
Yeah. I mean,
not even getting into...
Literally,
not even getting
his
into...
next album with the lead single in it.
We're not even getting into the Beady Eye albums, by the way, which honestly, if we were to do anything else Oasis related as a record club on, what is it, Different Lane, Still Speeding, whatever that first Beady Eye album is, would be, that would be Different Gear, Still Speeding. That would be a really funny record club to do, because that album is just hilarious. It has some good songs on it, but it's just fucking
I've never heard
bizarre.
of this.
I mean, there's literally a song on it called Beatles and Stones. And this was the album that Liam Gallagher made like right after Oasis broke up as well. Just
it was basically like they broke up Noel Gallagher did High Flying Birds, and
Yeah.
then BDI was the rest of Oasis. And the disparity in quality there, I think, really shines a light on the
Yeah, like
Wait, I feel like
role that Noel played in this band.
it's not talked about much, but like High Flying Birds have been like a very consistently strong band. They've got an album coming out this year, actually. And
Yeah.
so
maybe
like
it'll be good.
it's just really funny seeing how Noel Gallagher has, he hasn't challenged himself in any way with that project. It's very much Noel Gallagher writing the sorts of songs he's good at writing, but being very consistent and very kind of, and not attracting much attention because of that. Whereas Liam Gallagher has just had several has had a failed solo career, a band that completely tanked itself within, just a few years of existing, and is now basically just a Twitter personality. Like Liam Gallagher is like is our this is such a depressing thing to say. Liam Gallagher is like our Gen X David Crosby, except with
I knew you were going to say David Crosby.
never had any talent,
we live in
and
hell.
is completely skipping past the talent part to the Twitter personality part, and just kind of coasting on that. Which I don't even I think that's awesome. Good for him.
I want to, before we move to favorite tracks and ratings, I just wanted to mention two albums that I couldn't stop thinking about when listening to this record, in that I think a lot of what's simultaneously helped and hurt my enjoyment of Be Here Now is that I've just kind of discovered albums that do what this is attempting to do on either side of the gradient. And on one side, you have Ride. I think that, their first two albums, in particular Going Blank Again, that is what this album wants to be. That is the big, coked out, overblown, enormous shoegaze fucking like saturated thing that this album frequently attempts to be and doesn't quite get there, but in my opinion, that's the best version. And on the other end of the spectrum is someone who cited Be Here Now as being a direct inspiration on them, and that being Blue Rev by Always.
I knew you were gonna
I mean,
say
like that. It's because Blue Rev has such a they do everything that Liam and Noel couldn't do because they were just too coked out of their minds in terms of song
write
structure,
songs
key
on that
changes. They harness the actual rules of songwriting to the point where they channel this sound into something that feels palatable.
And
I just, when
they're
listening
all
to this,
3 minutes or less.
yes, they understand this, and they also make albums that are short enough to distill it into a point where you listen to it and you're like, yeah, that was the perfect size of that.
And they
So
have
if you are
distinguishable verses, choruses, and bridges, as opposed to the same musical idea applied to every construct of the song for 7 minutes.
all I'm saying here is that if you're a fan of this album, go seek those out. And also, forgot to mention, Richard Ashcroft is on this album on All Around the World. If you haven't listened to the first Verve album, what the fuck are you doing with your life?
I would actually say
it even has a song called Slide Away on it.
Yeah, Dave. I would actually say listen to the first Verve album because it's the best Verve album, but also listen to the second one as well, because that's like where Nick McCabe's guitar stuff gets really heavy and loud and distorted, and the songs are all 6 minutes long on that album. So Northern Soul by Verve, I would say, is maybe another influence here, because they were doing a kind of similar thing where they took their core, strengths and just kind of made endless jams out of them. So yeah, good reference point. And you mentioned Richard Ashcroft being on this. Most bizarre feature, though, has to go to Johnny Depp, who's credited with slide guitar on, I can't even remember which song. It's I think it might be Fading Out. It's one of the midsection songs anyway. But that's just
bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, this is emblematic of where they were at as well. Just this era of just complete excess and indulgence, and very, very much like akin to Hollywood, the Hollywood type of excess. So yeah, anyway, favorite tracks and ratings for Oasis Be Here Now. Jake, you go first.
All right. My 3 favorite tracks on here gotta be I Hope I Think I Know. Pretty easily my favorite thing on here. Then I'll say, I gotta commit All Around the World and Stand By Me. That's the one of the beloved tracks that I think really gets it right. Least favorite track, I am tempted to say it's Getting Better Man, just because it is both not a good song and just horrifically placed in terms of the track list. But honestly, the song I just get the flat out least enjoyment from is the title track. It's so standard. I fucking hate whatever that whistling noise is on the instrumental hook. Annoying as hell. It's just a thoroughly unremarkable song. Just do not like it at all. So that one, and I give the album a light but still effusive 6 out of 10.
Really like an emblematic moment of this record when the title track starts and that sound comes in, and it's just the most like awful sound that you've ever heard. It's just this completely just corrupted.
No.
And
No,
look,
sir.
a lot of like rock songs do the trick of like starting with a really kind of unpleasant dissonant sound, and then to kind of create a sense of tension, then the song just kind of comes crashing in.
But it just keeps going.
The song, it just keeps going. Morgan, your 3 favorite tracks, least favorite, and rating.
Yeah, 3 favorites: My Big Mouth, Don't Go Away, and Stand By Me. The most accessible tracks on here are really where they shine through. Least favorite, Magic Pie. Get Out of My Home. No. Overall, I'll give this a 6.5 out of 10.
All right, so the best song is, or the best song is Do You Know What I Mean? And I'll also throw in shouts for Fading Out and Girl in the Dirty Shirt. Least favorite is It's Getting Better Man, and this album gets a 3.5 from me, which gives us an average overall of 5.3 for Oasis Be Here Now. Let us know what you think of Oasis Be Here Now in the comments below. It's a divisive record. What side of the fence do you fall on? Are you fully in the bag? Are you completely alienated by it? Or are you somewhere in the middle? Let us know at home. We want to continue this conversation with you in the comments. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving it a like and subscribing if you have not already. Both those things help us a lot. If you're listening on Apple or on Spotify, you can head on over to the link in the description and you can leave us a like and subscribe and leave us a comment that way if you would like to do that. If you want to go above and beyond and support us directly, you can hit the join button, and for just $1 a month, you can support us directly. Get your name in the title call of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to listen to, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, though, folks, until next time, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Dom Perignon, come quickly, I am tasting the stars.